Good evening. I'm Farah Karim-Cooper of Shakespeare's Globe. Welcome to the final event of our third Shakespeare and Race Festival, but our first ever digital Shakespeare and Race Festival. This evening, I have the pleasure of introducing some wonderful guests. But before I do that, I want to say thank you to my colleagues and co-curators of the Shakespeare and Race Festival, Michelle Terry and Kobna Holbrook-Smith. I'm also extremely, extremely grateful to our digital and communications team for making this all possible. So this is going to be a very important conversation. It's about reckoning with our past. Living in Britain, what do we learn about British history and the role of colonialism and imperialism in that history? How do we talk about our past? So today, it's going to be an honor to introduce our panelists who each in their own ways have found a way to talk about that past. And Shakespeare is going to come into this conversation again and again. But again, we're thinking really about how we reckon with the past. So I'm going to introduce our panel. Our first panelist is Preti Taneja, whose novel We That Are Young sets Shakespeare's King Lear in contemporary India and is a blistering indictment of Indian fascism, corruption, misogyny, and human rights abrogations in Kashmir. It was Book of the Year in the Sunday Times, The Guardian, and The Spectator, and Book of the Decade in India's The Hindu newspaper. It won the Desmond Elliot Prize for the UK's Best Debut Novel of 2018 and has been translated into several languages. Preti also teaches writing in prisons and is a lecturer in creative writing at Newcastle University. So welcome, Preti.
Thank you.
I'm also joined by Margot Finn, who is Professor of Modern British History at University College London, where she teaches and researches British history with a special focus on British colonialism in South Asia. Recent publications include an open access co-edited volume on the East India Company at Home, which explores the material legacies of British imperialism in English, Scottish, and Welsh country houses. She's president of the Royal Historical Society, and in that capacity has been active in race equality and decolonizing the curriculum work. I have read the racial equality report she spearheaded, which was incredibly revealing about the discipline of history in this country, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that this evening. So welcome to you, Margot.
Thank you very much.
And finally, we welcome the wonderful actor, Elliot Barnes-Worrell, an award-winning actor, writer, and director from Southeast London. He is known for his role as Job Clouvers in the ITV crime drama series Van der Valk, and has recently starred in Soon Gone, a Windrush Chronicle for the BBC. As a stage actor, he has performed in Two Gentlemen of Verona and Henry IV for the Royal Shakespeare Company and Hamlet at the Almeida. He was also in Man and Superman at the National Theatre. In 2016, Elliot wrote and directed The Works, an exciting and cutting-edge modern reimagining of Shakespeare's plays, woven into one story and set on an estate in Peckham. Welcome to you as well, Elliot.
Thank you.
So thank you all for joining me this evening. I should also say that I sent a provocation to each of our panelists this evening, which I just want to share right now so that we can put us in the context of the conversation. In what ways can Britain reckon with its colonial and slave trading history? Now, the panelists were selected because collectively they would be able to consider this question through the lenses of creativity, representation, reception, research, and pedagogy. So all of those ideas are going to be sort of moving around the room as we speak this evening. Each of our panelists will give their assessment of that question, and then we'll go into a wider discussion after that. So I'm going to start with you, Preti.
For me, this is a political question, and it's a cultural question, and it's a personal question. And is the political answer a piercing austerity and a murderous hostile environment that infects the minds of everyone trapped in it? No. Is it the increase of stop and search powers, the expansion of prisons, and the pernicious and persistent denigration of black lives in this country, Muslim lives and working class lives, and particularly women from those communities' lives? No. Is it the closure of libraries and cultural centres, of youth services, and underfunding for the arts at the grassroots level or teaching poetry in schools? Of course not. I think if a political agenda is the protection and sustenance of a capitalist system that privileges a few wealthy groups against the catastrophic destruction of our planet and the masses who live under its clouds, then we need to stop and completely remove ourselves or work to demolish those systems and begin again with our knowledge of what has been missing or stunted or stymied and bring that to the surface to flourish. How can we reckon with our history if our present continues to perpetrate its worst ravages on its most vulnerable and disenfranchised, and then blame them for it, and pretend it does not see that, or if it does see that, use any means from violence to pacification to deny it and maintain the status quo? I don't think the reckoning we need is only about the ravages of imperial history, which are irrefutable no matter what certain voices very loudly say. I think, slavery happened, colonization happened, and it's still happening right here in the UK. The evidence and effects of that are everywhere. First, though, I think we have to reckon with the eons, and it really feels like eons of silencing and misdirections, the erasure of that. Whiteness and its agents must acknowledge the intentionality of that first and reckon with itself while we get on with making our own way in our own way, and then I think some truths will come to light. So then I think, a question arises about culture, about the role of culture in our lives and its value and to whom. I mean, diverse culture and representation, as we all know, is not just about casting a few people of colour into our stories, forget that they're quite often cast in subordinate roles, or in endless stories of arrival into a Western consciousness, assimilation, which is understood as a full humanity, nor is culture about majority tastemakers and gatekeepers curating us, appropriating us, or championing or rewarding certain cultures and expressions of culture over others, because I think that's equally dangerous. We need to stop paying attention to mainstream curating of culture along lines demarcated by nation states, which perpetrate further caste systems and class systems within them. And we all know that diversity is not equality. And that discrimination is infinitely and intersectionally nuanced. So we all have to be alive to that, even though we hopefully feel a sense of momentum right now, and it might seem that we're gaining ground. We have to be careful. And I think the work is continuous. The only way we can maintain the energy to reckon with it at all is to join up the decades and the generations of work that has gone into trying to make change before us, and keep all those ancestors and those warriors alive together at once. And for me, that's a perspective of sort of present moment futurity, which is a challenge to linear time and capitalist time. And I think actually that it's a perspective that Shakespeare as a playwright probably would have appreciated, actually, And that kind of brings me to canons and canon formation. I read a beautiful definition by Theodora Hajj-Michael in a blog recently, that canons retain the past as actively circulated memory. So we need new canons of old words to do the work of rememory, to use Toni Morrison's formation in Beloved. We need new canons. We need fuller archives. We need scholars of colour to archive them and teach them and expand them. And we need to teach them to students of colour and white students and help them to realise how our languages and our grammars and our histories, our formulation of time structures influences our thinking and our voices, and that these are equal and can positively enhance and work in different ways to English, which is the language of Shakespeare and of global capitalism, the system of power that we're all locked within. I think we need to see our way beyond decolonization, which to me is only a tool towards a full and fully felt emancipation of our minds, and express it in our economic systems, our cultural systems, and I think at every level of our institutions. I think we have to do joined up thinking, and that's what I'm saying, and use all of our senses. to see better, to listen better, and to answer to ourselves honestly. And we have to carry on this work in every generation before it's too late for another generation of young people of colour in this country, before they go hoarse and get tired, and the next generation have to come and do it all over again. Well, you could just go get coffee and talk about it after a lecture, and it's possible that every person in the cafe, bar maybe one, will be white, apart from all the people serving the coffee. And I can't be okay with that. And I think that's where the personal comes in. I mean, you can't be a privileged scholar in an elite institution and write about allyship if you don't know the history or acknowledge your own position. And the platform that you hold and that you're writing from, the place that gives you the authority and the invitation to speak on platforms and stages like this. You have to look at the data behind you and see your own place in it, and then decide on what to say and how to be. And so again, that really brings me to something very personal to me, and I did debate about whether I was going to talk about this or not, but this is to do with the writing of my novel, We That Are Young, which was written in a kind of peculiar state of grace, which I think is awarded to debut novelists. But it did come out of a struggle and privilege. And so, if I am thought of as a token in this sort of very elite world of literary fiction, or any writer of colour is thought of like that, then I don't think that's my problem. Because I know my own struggle, and I know my own privilege, and the struggle even within that privilege, and the responsibilities that that recognition offers me, and which I choose to take on. If there is a token, then whiteness is the problem. So I'll start, or I'll join, or I'll add my energy and voice to those who are seeking to change things from the outside, from the inside, from the bottom up, from the top down. And it takes a long time and a certain amount of energy, which is not inexhaustible. But the work can't stop, like I said, with arrival, no matter what the acceptable story of the immigrant writer is in literary fiction. And I think, we better turn to the poets as our way of understanding how to reckon. I think, in the UK, the poets are doing the work at the grassroots, and that really is in language. They invite us in. I'm thinking of Jackie Kay, Imtiaz Dharka, Nisha Ramaya, Pascal Petit. Let's not co-opt poetic form to advertise banks. Let's read and speak with poets instead. There's this wonderful book called To Be the Poet by Maxine Hong Kingston. And she writes that the reader of the long book lives with the story and its characters for a long time. The reader of poetry is awakened to the moment. As scholars and as activists and as women of colour working in poetry and poetically inflected prose, I think we have to do both, always, in our daily lives and in our actions. And I think that's how we reckon, and then we make evolution as well as revolution. We make lasting change, and the rest of it will soon be defunct.
Amazing. Thank you so much. There's so much in there for us to talk about. So thank you for sharing that and your personal side of it as well. Margot, to you.
Well, that's a very hard act to follow, I must say. I think when I'm approaching the question that you've set us, I think there are 5 things that we need to do, and I've tried to reduce each of those 5 things to 2 words, which I'll then elaborate. And the first 2 words, or one thing, I think resonates with what you've just said. I think the first thing we have to do is acknowledge or admit. And starting from that place of acknowledgement and admitting, with specific respect to the slave trade, the wider systems of slavery that came out of it, and the wider imperial and colonial states that emanated out from that, start by acknowledging and admitting. And I think the crucial thing I would say as an historian is, this is not new. It's not as if suddenly in the past 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, this new knowledge has sprung up. And the reason it hasn't been inserted into existing histories is because it's so new and we're not sure it's really there or true. There is so much that is completely known and completely uncontroversial about the slave trade, about systems of slavery, and about the wider imperial networks that they're in, that if it were a medical discovery and it hadn't been inserted into the practice of medicine, we would be shocked and furious and on the streets. So this is not new. And if we cannot acknowledge and admit, then we're in a radical state of denial. And it's as if we were denying that you can take antibiotics and it will be good for an infection. So we really, really have to simply start by acknowledging and admitting, because sure, there are known unknowns and there are unknown unknowns about the histories of the slave trade and slavery and empire. There's lots more we need to know, but there's so much that we already know. So let's start with the first step, which is acknowledge and admit. My second step is learn and understand. And here, I think, again, the evidence and interpretation is so deep, is so broad, and is so in your face that we really have to ask ourselves why we're not picking it up. I think there are major curriculum failures in Britain, in schools to a lesser extent, but still in universities as well. But that's a reason why we don't know as much and as well as we should. It's not an excuse. Yes. The material is not only there, it's in the public domain. And a lot of it is open access on the web. So it's not that one has to have a very high budget to get to this information. There's really top-class research from big university teams. And I would particularly suggest in that context the Slave Voyages database, which reflects research that began in the 1970s. Again, emphasizing my point, this is not new. Yep. A lot of those databases, this big database that began to come out in 2008, which again is more than a decade ago, those were researchers who were working in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. So the major knowledge about the slave trade, sure, we know a lot more now than we did 20 years ago, but we knew a hell of a lot 20 years ago compared to what we knew 40 years ago. So acknowledge, admit, learn, and understand. And the Slave Voyages database, which is slavevoyages.org, completely open access, first-class scholarship from a very broad research team of not just British scholars. And their lowest estimate of the number of persons who were seized and enslaved and transported across the Atlantic purely from British traders, and again, this is the lowest estimate, is 3,259,441. The total European slave trade, their lowest estimate, 12,521,337. We have to acknowledge, admit, understand, and interpret. So that's my second step. My third step is insert and connect. I think it's absolutely essential that we take what we think we know and connect this knowledge, not new knowledge, but perhaps new to too many people, connect it and then insert it in, and we'll come up with very, very different narratives than what we have before. Now again, this is not a new type of history that I am coming out and championing. This is something that has been going on now for decades, and arguably, particularly vis-a-vis the slave trade and slavery, much of this thinking begins with the Trinidadian politician and historian Eric Williams, who published his Capitalism and Slavery in 1944, right? So, grandparents were being born when this was being, this kind of work was being published as books. It's a long, long time ago. Now, Williams had what is in some ways a controversial thesis, much more multiple than I'm going to make it here, linking British slavery and the rise of industrial revolution in Britain. Some aspects of that interpretation are contested. Others are still today being worked into the best historical narratives. My colleagues at UCL and the Legacies of British Slave Ownership team have looked particularly at British people's compensation and European people's, more broadly, compensation for the abolition of slavery in 1833/34, and have traced that legacy not just into commerce and industry, but into cultural organizations, philanthropic organizations, the way in which which the structures of the British state, as well as the underpinning capitalist formation of the economy, were fundamentally channeled through slave societies. And those slave societies established in the Caribbean, established in the Cape Colony, which is now the southern portion of South Africa, and in Mauritius as well. Significantly, it's only in that part of the British Empire in which slavery was abolished in 1833 for ultimately complete abolition in 1938. India, which was also very much under British control in that time period, does not see the abolition of slavery in that time period. And does India have slavery in that time period? Absolutely. British elites are purchasing people in India as enslaved persons well into the 40s and 50s. So that was my third step, which again is one about learning. Fourth, I think the thing we have to do is we have to evaluate and we have to assess. Once we know, we can begin to make evaluations. We can begin to assess the significance, the importance. And I think this builds on one of the things that you said, Preti, that's going to revolutionize how we understand fundamental concepts and fundamental structures. And I'll just take one, and that's liberal and liberalism. So the era which sees the abolition both of the slave trade and of slavery is one celebrated in British history for British liberalism. Well, you kind of have to ask, if you have slavery and the slave trade, how liberal is this? What is the meaning of liberalism? So historians now are really sort of picking apart that notion of liberalism and freedom. Our whole notion of freedom, something that politicians bandy about, left, right, and center. Can't wear a mask because of your British-born freedom. That notion of freedom has to be reinserted into these narratives, and it's going to come out of that washing machine looking quite different, is what I would say. William Gladstone, for example, a key liberal prime minister of the Victorian era. Where does his father's money come from? It comes from slavery in the Caribbean. And when slavery is abolished, where do those firms get their money from? They get it from South Asia. And one of the things I was trying to do in my research as well is to link South Asia back into that Caribbean world of slavery. And that's something that goes back even before the 18th century. What is traded for human persons on the West African coast who will be sent to the Caribbean? Cotton textiles from India. Why are the British in South Asia? Well, that's one of the reasons that answers that question. So connecting those different types of history and subverting our conceptual arbitrary, I think that's just something that we're going to have to do. And then finally, my fifth thing is we need to repair and we need to think about reparations. And I think we can only do that once we understand, once we have the knowledge, though a lot of that knowledge is already there. So I'm not suggesting a 20-year wait here. But I think we have to think about repairing. And repairing is about unpicking the racialized structures that we live in culture and society and the economy and the state. And it's not about giving a check to a certain number of people because a money payment isn't sufficient. We're talking about something that is structured through society. So yes, I would imagine that reparations is going to mean a different flow of money, but it's about stepping back and looking at the deep structures that we've created through the slave trade, a slave society, a colonial and an imperial state, and its outgrowths, and then thinking about how can we undo that damage. And again, a part of the admitting and acknowledging is admitting and acknowledging to deep damage.
Wow, thank you, Margot. There's so much that you've said there that I feel is just sitting in the room right now. There's so much to discuss, and I feel a little bit numb. Some of the, I suppose, the knowledge that you've just dropped. I mean, I, as someone who is a professor of Shakespeare studies, who studies the early modern period, there's so much in what you said I didn't know, and it's shocking. How much we don't know as a culture. So there's so much to talk about. So we're going to move now to Elliot.
It's such a hard thing to even try to start to come up with a response in how to tackle it or cure it, because this isn't it, you know? I didn't write notes because I really wanted to respond and listen. But I think a lot of it is a lot of my thinking has to come from my people and how we express ourselves and how we defend ourselves and how we keep ourselves safe. Because every person of colour, every black, brown person here in the UK is on the wrong side of the colonial story. And the white people that are in power now, board members, artistic directors, politicians, are all on the side of taking from colonialism and slavery, and generations down and down and down, they're still in charge today. So when you are black or brown in this country, you can't wake up and not think that today's a fight. Every single day is a fight. And when you have to start your day from that standpoint, start your life from that standpoint, how do you compete? How do you start to come into these conversations? And then you get the chosen brown person that the white oppressor has chosen to come and represent, or chosen to come and be good in that situation, which is about your poetry in like Coca-Cola commercials or in bank commercials. All of those people making those decisions are white. All of those people selling those dreams are black now. So that's also not it. So we're taking these sort of model minorities, the good Negro that James Baldwin would talk about, and emblazing them and putting them center stage, but surrounding them by whiteness. Even if you have a stage play where the protagonist is black in a place that they wouldn't have historically been black, it's still a white production because it's essentially coloring that production black. Even if the director is black, are you coming into a situation where you know how to tell your story outside of the gaze of whiteness? Have you been given that permission? The fact that you have to be given it because of all of these institutions are white in the first place. What I'm trying to say is that it takes a lot for a black person, let me talk from my experience, a brown person, to figure out who they are and what they want, not in relation to whiteness. Because all we have is that as a parameter. I can trace my ancestors back so far because if my ancestors are from the Caribbean, it means that they were slaves. The erasure of where you're from in Africa, there are people today that are older than Nigeria. The Ivory Coast is still called the Ivory Coast. So when you're trying to figure out who you are and how you represent in these spaces, how do you do that unpacking without the tyranny of white supremacy on you all of the time? This building that we're in now, Shakespeare benefited from slavery, or else he wouldn't have been able to do what he did. He wouldn't have been able to write plays. That was going on right at that time. So we've got to call a spade and say that was racism. So he benefited from racism. And him being a benefactor from racism is in his plays. Yeah. So how do you invite me into a space like this, and I sit in the audience and I watch a white actor playing Proteus compare Julia to a sweaty Ethiop? Or watch Portia say, "May everyone of his complexion choose me so," when they're talking about black people. You can't. You can't. But then we need Shakespeare to pass our GCSEs. We need Shakespeare to pass our A-levels. And we damn sure need Shakespeare to pass our university degrees if we're studying English literature. So with these bars against us, to take a word of his, how do we win? So that's the question. I feel like Shakespeare is built upon misogyny and racism and anti-Semitism. It's there. We have to say what it is. But we're all here, I believe, because Shakespeare can take it. Like, when I made the works, what I wanted to do was, instead of bring ourselves up to assimilate whiteness in order to speak Shakespeare's language, I wanted to drag Shakespeare from his pedestal, just the same way that the slavers were dragged off of theirs in Bristol, and bring him into cultures where he doesn't fit and cut him up to make him fit, instead of trying to disfigure ourselves to be something that's more appropriate or nicer to look at for whiteness. So I feel like there is a way, but every single situation that you're in, when you look up at these buildings or these situations, you cannot help but see the abuse of your ancestors. So how do you claim those spaces? There are ways. There is a way. You take it out of context, you make it yours, you make it a safe space for black and brown people to enter. How do you make it a safe space when the board members are white and the artistic directors are white? And if that artistic director directs a play or is in a play, then that speaks to the elitism of whiteness in that building. So, I'm getting there, I'm arriving at my point. Is that it can't just be a situation where you colour something black, where you invite in a black director and have black actors on a stage, and they are under the tyranny of white supremacy to perform a play that if they were white would be no different. You have to allow them to allow us freely to see where this language fits within us. Not with the tyranny of someone looking over us, the overseer being like, this is how it fits in here, you have to wear these clothes, these are the rules. It's about reimagining that space and reclaiming it. And if Shakespeare is this thing that we have to do, which I love to do, we have to figure out a way in which we feel safe. What we're always doing as black and brown people in Britain, in colonial spaces, post-slavery spaces, is trying to feel safe. It's why you see groups of mandem on the street throwing bottles at police, is they're trying to feel safe. It's why you see black people playing down their achievements because they don't want to rise above the precipice to get their head chopped off, is they're trying to feel safe. So if you provide that safety already, then we can start to understand ourselves and figure out how we present these plays, these classical white plays, for us and by us. It can take it. You take that Ethiop lion out, it's not helpful. There's some plays that should never be done, they're not helpful. Yeah. And I think if we're not brave enough to say stuff like that, to challenge stuff like that, to be like, actually, this is the old hat, you need to go. Some people, we need to wait for them to die. Some people need to step down immediately. It's just facts, and I'm not gonna mince my words about it. I promised when I came here, I'd be brave. And the bravery is standing for the people that have come before me, my ancestors, and the tyranny that I go through every single day. And just because we're post-George Floyd now, doesn't mean that it's always been going on. We've always been the victim of it. Whether it's on the streets with our lives, or we come into a building and we hear someone call our ancestors, our mothers, our sisters, sweaty Ethiops. There is a way, I think especially here, where we don't have to fit into the quiet British culture of hiding white crimes and clapping politely at the end of shows. There's something more alive. There's some way that we can take these words that have been used to oppress us and claim them and do it from us, but we have to have that space and not be interfered with. So, I don't think going back is an understanding from a black and brown perspective is helpful. I think that white people need to think about it every single day, and every week needs to be Shakespeare and Race Week, because it will just start slipping back. Every day. If I have to wake up and fight every day, and if you're white and you wake up and you have the option of doing it or not, then we're never going to exist on equal playing field, especially within art. If I get blackballed by certain places for standing up for who I am, then we're never going to be. So you need to do that work every day, and why should I meet you if you haven't? Why should I come into your rooms and come into your spaces? The analogy that I think fits this the best is not assuming that we're all the same. It's like disability is seen as something less than, where it's not. It's just another way of existing on this planet. Being black and brown is another way of existing. So if you put the handle to a door at the height in which a straight white man can open that door, then that door doesn't work for everybody. But if you design that door, still has the same function, it opens and closes, but the handle's in a different place that everybody can reach, then you're not putting these bars against people. Where currently, we have to, if you're not able-bodied, reach for that doorknob, and if you're not a straight white man, have to really think about your place there. Whereas if the door just opens on pushing, which everyone should be able to do, then we can start a conversation of what happens next. But while I'm still on this stage to talk about race, and that's the first time I've been invited in a long time, then we ain't getting nowhere. Every day, it's every day. It's not today, it's every day. It's yesterday as well. It's before George Floyd died and you put up black squares on your Instagram. You knew slavery was wrong then. I want to start a conversation now because I'm done speaking.
Thank you so much for that. So there's a lot for us to draw out of things that you guys have discussed this evening. One of the questions I think that's emerged for me, and I think that will also leak out in terms of how we talk about poetry, how we talk about Shakespeare, it's a lack of will, I suppose, that you're alluding to on the part of British culture to engage fully with its past. Because I think you've each acknowledged that if you're not going to engage with it on a daily basis, then you're not actually doing anything. That lack of will and that lack of engagement with the history has led to conversations that are happening in our culture at the moment, which are Britain's a tolerant society, there's no racism here, and that again is another form of racism. So I just want to get to Margot, to a question to you first, and actually it's all of us can just talk. We don't need to be formal about how we conduct the rest of this panel conversation. You said that this material, this knowledge has been in the ether for a very long time. And I'm trying to get my mind around why it is. I mean, I can think the usual reasons, white supremacy, holding up the status quo, but why is it that our children aren't learning about this in their classes? Why is it that your racial equality report says that there are virtually no black historians employed in this country? So I just want to get to the bottom of that question, and from your point of view, from inside the Royal Historical Society, what is your view of why?
So you started with will, which I do think is very, very important, but I think is not sufficient. And I think some of the topics that you've both brought out in your responses are going to be really relevant here. So there is individual willpower. You know, we have differing levels of ability to do anything, but all of us have some ability to engage with this. If you're black or brown, that's forced upon you. If you're white, it's more optional. But all of us, you know, have this potential to engage, and will is involved there. But there are also structures. There are ideological structures, and there are structures. There's your board that you're talking about. There's the peopling of structures, and there is the funding of structures. And I think we have to think about all of those things. And then there are canons as well. And one of the things that I heard when I heard you say there are some plays that shouldn't be performed and we can leave them out, that's what a canon does. It's just a canon has said, the Merchant of Venice inside the canon, loads of other Shakespeare plays. nowhere near the canon, right? So that filtering out of what's great and what's inside the canon and what's not is something that's been happening for centuries. But then when you say that play shouldn't be performed because it's not going to allow any black or brown person to have a safe space in that theatre or that play, then it's Toby Young who's going to get up on his high horse and say trigger warnings, snowflakes, all of those things are going to happen. So there's will is important, but it's not sufficient and it's embedded in other things. Let's talk a little bit about structures. So structures, particularly if we look at school level, say, which I think is really, really important. That's, for me as an historian, that's where we turn many people off history by not teaching them a full history. Increasingly, in contrast to the histories they can get if they go onto the web. The histories that are there, including really good, robust ones, the novels they can pick up, the things that they can get from somebody like the Brown Hijabi and people on Twitter who are just doing amazing work with race and with history. So the structures are partly that with academization, you don't have to teach the national curriculum. And within the national curriculum, you don't have to learn about slavery. At most, you might have half an hour, and you're going to start with abolition. You're not actually going to talk about the slave trade, except at the moment in which, well, we all know Wilberforce, that lone white man who abolished slavery. So it's partly about structures. How much time are you going to dedicate in a curriculum? How are you going to teach those teachers to do it? Where do those teachers get their knowledge from? If you're not teaching it in universities, they're not going to have it. So thinking actually about structures is really important. But then thinking about who wins if you don't teach it. And I think for me, that's ultimately the question. Who wins if we don't teach that? Who does not have to do the work you've talked about every day if we don't teach it? And if we say that was a long time ago, nobody can be held responsible for what their great-great-great-great-grandparents did. And this isn't about holding me responsible for my great-great-great-great-grandparents or any of us responsible for this. This is about acknowledging where we all come from. And I think one of the things that we do, if we can do that, is that we actually find an entangled human history and keeping that entangled human history and then recognizing that different humans suffer different pathways because of, for example, slavery, for example, race, then comes out of that. But I don't think we can't simply make it about individual will. We also have to look at structures, and we have to look at capitalism, which,
which
Preti raised pretty eloquently.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think, Preti, your point about the canon was really important as well. And a lot in the ether, there's a lot of conversation at the moment about how we decolonize, and we've been asking the question here, how do we decolonize Shakespeare? And you said something really interesting in that actually that's just a tool. That's not the end game. That's not the end goal, as it were. So can you say a little bit more about the canon and...
Okay. I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that you said, because I appreciate some of the ways in which you're opening up this conversation and talking about structures, but I think that there's a lot more that happens when history isn't taught fully than people get turned off history. I grew up I was born here, I grew up here, I did the national curriculum. I had a history that I understood from my mother, my aunts, my grandmother, who was totally traumatized by partition to the extent she couldn't come here without it killed her. She moved in 1947 from Pakistan, what is now Pakistan, with an enormous migration of people. And those stories that you hear in these fragments through your aunts and your mother and your cousins there in India, whatever, and you're just beginning to think, okay, these women, they're just chattering and I'm hearing all of this stuff. How can this be true? Because it's not endorsed at school. This is the pinnacle of whiteness and westernization and assimilation and the safe space we're supposed to have as free individuals to go into classrooms and say, okay, I'm supposed to be aspiring to be good at this in this in this world, in this school world. So something is put on the curriculum, therefore it must be important. And I'm supposed to get an A in it. I'm supposed to do well because that's a good immigrant narrative. And you're getting that all of the way that you get. So if I'm not supposed to know this other history that my own mother and my grandmother and all of these women are telling me, then surely they must be wrong, they must be crazy, they're making it up, they're lying to me. And it doesn't turn you off history. It completely schisms your mind. And into that space comes a kind of shame, which isn't my shame to take on. And it takes years to learn that isn't my shame to take on.
If you learn it.
If you do, if you do. And if you don't, the other thing that may happen is that you will end up being this kind of person who is co-opted into whiteness and becomes a politician who can stand in a room and denigrate somebody with a darker skin than yours because you think you have a personal experience where it happened to you, you were once called a pucky, and therefore you were fine, look how well you did.
Yeah.
And you can write a book about, if this immigrant person can pull their socks up like me, then everybody's fine and equal. And that is just a complete result of a national curriculum that doesn't want to be honest about a full and free history, because there are real minds being shaped in that moment. It's not just, okay, I won't be a history professor. So that really is also connected to the idea of, okay, if we want to understand all of these people as equal humans, we have to then do the work of saying part of that colonization of the mind and the history of racism and the history of transatlantic slavery is that a whole swathe of people were not considered human.
Yeah.
So that is where we have to begin, with that violence of who gets to be called human and who is deciding that humanity.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to be decided on by that humanity categorization. That categorization belongs to a kind of thinking which only can have, and writers have said this before me, poets have said it before me, historians have said it before me, that can only have someone that they can say is inhuman for them to feel like they're fully human. It's not a system that I accept. It's not a system I want to be part of. And as an educator, as a writer, I'm going to do everything I can with the language that I have to make sure that that is not passed on to students and younger people. And you were asking me about how we can decolonize Shakespeare or what decolonization is. And, I think one of the things that I research as an academic is how Shakespeare is done in different parts of the world and why. So first, I think we have to understand the politics of dissemination, how that Shakespeare travelled out of this globe into that globe.
Yeah.
Because you can't separate that from his genius.
That's right.
And then maybe, see how people in their own countries are using it to challenge a liberal, white-constructed system, including things like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is a very white-constructed system, maybe to kind of talk between India and Kenya without coming through this globe first. Maybe to talk between, Mexico and Democratic Republic of the Congo, and do not pass through the UK or the English language. See what similarities, and if you're doing this, then you need to dissolve the idea of diaspora in some sense as well, because diaspora still kind of predicates centres. So for me, for those of us who are second generation, who are born in this country or grew up in this country, we have to be able to accept ourselves as fully human with all of these different influences. So I'm not like half this or half that. I'm just born of lots of different things, and these are the voices that I have and the languages that I have to use the Shakespeare that I have in my own way. And I feel like, when I teach Lear or I talk about King Lear or I press, what I'm doing with that is, if you're only working in Shakespeare's English, if your language is only English, then what your role and responsibility is to press that language, rinse it as hard as you possibly can, turn it inside out, dry it out, and then, it will yield the instructions, I think, to power's destruction. And that's kind of what I was trying to do in the novel, just the tools are there inside the master's house, as it were. They're not the whole tool, because your own ability with your own language and the way your own structures in your mind work and how you can do that. But if you press Shakespeare enough, he reveals his own structural inequalities, the absurdity, the hubris of power, you know, the posturing, the shame of elites. And I think, you know, people with many languages who grow up in this country or whatever can do that on their own terms. And I feel like for me, that's the kind of new government of the tongue.
Yes. So, history in schools. I did history at school.
It's a disaster area, I acknowledge.
And what is incredibly tough about history at school is that it encourages you to learn about white supremacy as a good thing. And if you don't fit into that, why should you go more deeper into history to learn more about your oppressed nation and your oppressed people? When a lot of the language of history in Africa is spoken, not written. So how would you even get back to the kingdoms of Africa? When we talk about abolition in the UK, why do we not talk about Lauda Equiano? Like, it's a name that people don't even know. Why would I go through that labor, you know, in order to understand myself better when I'm not going to be rewarded in any British structure for that? So if I do double history, the history I have to learn at school and then history for myself, then I'm doing 5 times as much labor, because I'm already doing the 3 times more being a black individual in that space anyway, and being a victim of violence from the teacher's mouth about where I come from. Appearing with slavery, disappearing again, coming back with Martin Luther King and disappearing again, and then popping up now, being shot on the streets of America. So we're not rewarded for that. Even when these GCSE result things came out, the only microphones and cameras on black and brown people were the ones that were going to achieve A stars and achieve BBC instead, and therefore they couldn't go to Cambridge or Oxford, and then therefore they were a failure, right? And we don't pay any recognition to the black and brown students that grades don't reflect the white model of success, because that's all it really is. It's remembering white facts and lies and then writing them down in a white structure that you've been taught in this country, and then regurgitating them somewhere so you can be contrary in another room somewhere else in whiteness and sort of erase your identity. And when we're talking about Shakespeare in history and claiming it, this beautiful thing that you were talking about not having to go through Britain to understand it. Like, if I'm a person of colour from somewhere and you're a person of colour from somewhere, we have to meet on this white place in order to understand one another, a third way. But I will say to that I'm Black British. That's what I know. That's who I am. And we have had to carve out our identity through the trauma of living in Britain under white supremacy and governments that are literally trying to kill us. Like, calling people letterboxes and pickaninnies is a mandate for murder. Like, let's have it right. But we've carved out a beautiful culture that is not only influenced from Africa and the Caribbean and India and Pakistan, but also from London streets and white working class London. And we found another way. So when I made the works, one of the reasons that I put white working class voices alongside with black and brown faces and queer voices is because it's kind of a counter-colonial group that already exists. And what I have found is Shakespeare sounds better. I don't think Shakespeare works in RP. I think it's always shit in RP because it's literally a learned accent for radio taken by white people to inform white people when the ships are coming in or how to treat a black person on the street. Shakespeare predates that. And because Shakespeare is as removed from today's theatre scene as is, like, I don't know, some remote mountain in Japan where they still do things uninfluenced by technology, why on earth would we get posh elite actors to come on stages and shout at the audience? When really, when you hear it in the old accents, in the original accents, in accents that people haven't learnt from school or from academia or from politicians, accents that they can emote in, accents that come from their ancestors, then you have a completely different relationship with it, and all of a sudden I can engage and I feel safe. But when it's spoken to me in the same alienating RP white way as our politicians and teachers and police speak to us, why on earth, why would I engage with that? How are you gonna keep me safe? And then when I see a black person on that stage and they have to do the same song and dance as everybody else, I'm just like, you're lost. That doesn't mean I don't know black people that are RP. That's what they have found out of their cultures. It's who they are. But if you're forcing us to accept a way of walking and moving, same with history, forcing us to learn the great British Empire, lauding people that get MBEs and OBEs, then why on earth would we dig deeper?
You said something really important. I mean, everything you've said is important, but I think you were talking about Shakespeare's language specifically earlier, and we had one of our events the other night where we were talking about the language of Romeo and Juliet, and some of the imagery that is used to sort of, I suppose, elevate Juliet's beauty against the knight, as it were. And the word Ethiop comes up a lot in Shakespeare, doesn't it, in Midsummer Night's Dream as well. And you were suggesting that you just cut those. It's better to just get those words out. How did you deal with that language when you were reimagining Shakespeare in your project?
I wanted to award the actors that I was working with the freedom to explore it without having acts of violence against them, which is what Ethiop does. It's like if you hear the N-word ever, anywhere, your reaction is so strong that it's almost like you have no control over it. So by finding the people that have felt alienated for those reasons and giving them this poetry, not through a white way, through me to them, having already found the unhelpful things and just gone, we don't need that. They ain't gonna help us here. That's not where the beauty of this story is. I understand you need to understand that about Shakespeare, that there's racism in his works to get who he is. But I kind of don't care who he is, to be honest with him. His poetry's, I don't give a shit who Shakespeare is. I don't care if it's like 8 people wrote it, a monkey wrote it. I don't care. What we do have is we have the poetry.
Yeah.
And what we have with poetry is that we have the choice now how we interpret this. Any work of art now belongs to us. So if I see anti-Semitism, I have Jewish heritage, so that's gone. If I see anything about sweaty Ethiops, I'm like, well, that's a beautiful image for me, but you're using it the wrong way. That's gone. White snow on a raven's back, I don't see bright and white as beautiful like that. That's gone. And then you start to reveal something that speaks to you.
Yeah.
That's what I mean about cutting him up to fit us. Because if we have to cut ourselves up to fit him, we're just doing the violence that colonialism and slavery and his plays already do to us. We have to know him to pass our exams.
Maybe we just have to know him to pass. That is the whole kind of point, isn't it? Where if you can do this work, then you can end up in a certain position. And a lot of what you're saying is just it is an extraordinary thing to be able to sit on this stage to say these words. And we know while we're doing it, we're risking something, which is high risk. It is high risk. And we have to do it because we've reached a stage where if we don't, then we will only end up suicidal, literally, in ourselves, because we had this moment, and we have to kind of navigate that power structure in our own mind that says, am I do I be grateful for this in a certain particular kind of way, or can I be grateful for it because I've achieved something for myself that's important enough for me to be here? Do I risk saying something that's going to offend and shut doors for me, which will never be said that I shut this door because of what you said on that day? It will always be you're not quite right, or this, someone else, or, you know. But the more that we censor ourselves when we have these opportunities, the less we will be able to live humanly in the world. And it's done, you know, it's 2020 in the most extraordinarily difficult year that we've seen, that has risen up so many different problems which are just generations old, and, you know, risk, what do we have left to lose here?
I think that's what, sorry to jump in, but I think that's what I'm advocating for, about understanding yourself outside of whiteness. And that's what I did with the Shakespeare things, with the quarantine Shakespeare that I did, and with the works, is how do we understand this poetry outside of the tyranny of holding this guy up as a god or a genius, and outside of whiteness that supports that. How do we understand that? And that's what I feel like, a way that I feel like I have been able to understand it, and how I direct it, and how I work with actors, is I go, let's take this completely out of the context of this and just claim it for ourselves. Because if we have to go through whiteness to understand everything that's going on, then we're always going to be the victim of something. And that's when the suicidal and the not wanting to engage. Why should I? If you invite me here, why would I come? If I don't have agency over myself and my black body and my black skin in this space, and it becomes a problem for you, so then therefore I have to inherit it being a problem for me. I'm not about that. It's why I created the works as a piece of film, same with Quarantine Shakespeare, because I didn't have to go through any institution and structure until they're ready to accommodate my big black self. Like, when they are ready to accommodate, then we will come. But it's just really tough that you have to squeeze in and diminish yourself in order to stand in these spaces.
We recently did a podcast about whiteness in Shakespeare, and we talked, and whiteness in education, whiteness on our stages. A couple of episodes have yet to come out. But the one about education really talked about drama school and the students of color in drama schools. So what you were saying is really profound, but I'm wondering, what do you tell young actors who are entering this world now? And maybe, and young scholars of color, for example, young novelists of color, how do we open that space for them? How do we empower them to feel that sense of agency and autonomy?
I've just come off the back of, during this, God man, the emotional labor for black and brown people never stops, innit? But I've just come off the back, during this time, Central released a statement. I went to Central. It's where I experienced the worst racism I've ever experienced. Released a statement about supporting Black Lives Matter. And I've just been part of a big movement of, like, calling them out, figuring it out. And it's all to make the next generation of black and brown actors safe in those walls. That's the work we have to do. When the civil rights movement constantly quote, like, to be cliche, but when Martin Luther King says, I might not get there with you, it's not about me. So if a young person now wants to go to drama school, a young person of color, I first try and investigate which drama schools are safe, of which none of them are. So then I try and support them with lots of black and brown bodies around them so they have someone to come to. I'm just part of setting up an external board that holds drama schools accountable for racism, that students report to them, not internally. Nothing gets done. And then I go, okay, so you have to do Shakespeare to get into these drama schools. How do we do that and you don't feel stupid? How do we do that and when it's not on your bookshelf at home? How do we do that when a white teacher that has no talent in bringing a story to life has told you to read Othello, where you have just been encouraged, if you're a black boy, Othello is encouraged to recount his traumas for white people. That's what we're encouraged to do all the time. So I try my best to bring Shakespeare to them in a way that they can get excited about it. And they do, man. Like, it's exciting shit. Shakespeare's exciting shit to read. It's so sick. So as soon as when you're like, actually, imagine that as your mum, your immigrant mum, or your second generation mum from your black or brown household, if this was happening now, what would that mean? Unlock something for them, because they don't have to go through whiteness to get there. And they come in with the confidence of like, I've got something to show you. Not, is this good enough? But I can't, once they're behind those doors, the only thing I can offer is support. And I fear for them. The same way that if I could look back on myself, I'd be very fearful for the 18-year-old Elliot that went to drama school, because he experienced horrific racism. And I've experienced that in the real world, in theatre, in my day-to-day life, walking in and out of theatres, performing on these stages. And you just have to keep making noise. And luckily I'm in a position where I don't really care if anyone hires me on these theatres if they don't want it. But hopefully what I'll say and do will make the person that really wants it a little bit safer.
Yeah, it's so important to have this conversation about how we construct these spaces for our peers, not just for the younger generation, but for our peers and for people who are writing novels. I have these conversations a lot, and this is what I think about this. I think, my own novel went through a process of being rejected so many times by every publisher in London, a few in India, and it's quite well known now, okay, that I got published by a very small independent press in Norwich, Gallybeggar Press, who took this book after, a few years of struggle. And it took me a long time to get my head around what was going on there, but it just... in the end, you have to say to yourself, but what it taught me to do was, the more you get told no, again, I think the less you have to lose, but maybe the more you have to prove in a way. So what I say to young writers of colour, or writers of colour who are trying to do it after years and years and still going 10 years later, is just don't try and please anyone on one side. Don't try and prove how brown you are or how black you are. Don't try and prove how white you can be. Just find your voice and just don't look sideways, don't look left, don't look right. Look at your own page, listen to your own voice, and just the rest can go to hell. Because all you have to lose is answering to yourself at the end of the day. So if your language is multiplicitous, if you grew up in 5 different cities, if you've collected language from adverts, if you've got something to say about what it means for your voice to be changed over time by the education that you have to go through, those things are important, that you capture them on the page. Those things are the ways that you can be yourself. And, so that's to do with the writing world. But then you're going to encounter a group of gatekeepers who don't know how to read this work, because they're going to read it and they'll be like, this isn't quiet enough. It isn't modest enough. It isn't pale enough. It isn't clever enough. It isn't, because what they're used to reading is a certain kind of syntax that is good writing. And so that is how this sorting works. You may not enter into the halls of the upper echelons of a certain kind of publisher if you aren't performing your identity to the max, or you're finding a market, going into a mainstream white market. So you have to find those editors and those agents and those publishers who have that track record. Look at the numbers of people whose work that they publish that you think, okay, I want to sit alongside these people because I will be safe here. My work will be understood here. I will be supported to have the career here, because it's not just about your debut book. It's about your next thing and your next thing and your next thing. And the license that's afforded to young or writers of colour who break through, and I didn't get published till I was 39, 40, and you can't fail that first time. You can't be seen to fail, because if you do, you may never do this again.
Yeah.
That isn't right. That doesn't happen to our counterparts. Yeah. So that's important. And when it comes to things like young people in a university situation, this question of, do you really want to go to Cambridge? Okay. Great, you have been told all your life that this is the best place for you. And I speak as somebody who did go to Cambridge. And I've also been inside the Cambridge academic system. I've supervised and, I've been part of a fellowship as a sort of honorary scholar there. I can't even begin to talk about those mixed experiences because I haven't processed them in myself yet. But when you get there, I would say, great, now your work is triple hard because what you have to protect against most of all is that you won't fall for this idea that you can't then open the door for the next person when that happens. You can't allow yourself to be surrounded by this culture where if you're the only one in the room, then you must be so special that no one else you can never help anyone else coming up behind you, because that is how this thing perpetrates. Yes. This is how silences go through peer groups and generations, and we end up competing with each other. So when I'm educating, I'm trying to make connections between these peer groups all the time. It's because they're their best support networks. Cambridge, Oxbridge, all these places, they are terribly difficult environments for all young people going into them, for young people of colour especially, and there are nuances within that as well. So what can we do? All we can do is model something when we get the chance to do that. And we might not make it, but someone will.
Unfortunately, we have to stop the conversation there. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panelists. You have brought up such really important points for us to be thinking about, for our audiences to be thinking about. It was a really fantastic way to end the festival. If you would like to join for questions after this panel, we will be regrouping on Twitter if you have any questions for any of our panelists this evening. Other than that, it's time to say goodbye. And thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.